Picture this: 40,000 Ottoman soldiers, elite janissaries, heavy Sipahi cavalry, the best war machine on earth, brought to their knees without a single sword swing. It's 1394, and instead of charging into glory, the Ottoman army is collapsing from the inside out. Men drop their shields just to clutch their stomachs. They fall to their knees along the muddy banks of the Danube. Some are vomiting so violently they're spitting blood into the dirt. They're dying of thirst in a land overflowing with water, because every well they dig into is packed with rotting dog carcasses. Every stream they follow runs sick with death, livestock butchered and dumped miles upstream, turning the water into poison. Sultan Bayezid I, the man they call the Thunderbolt for his lightning-fast conquests, can only stand and watch, because he can't strike lightning against disease. He can't behead a fever. He marched the greatest army on earth straight into a biological weapon. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a kill box, and it was designed by a warlord who understood one brutal truth: survival sometimes requires monsters. This is the calculated cruelty of Mircea the Old, the man who taught Dracula everything he knew about fear. And before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival, suffering, and the kind of warfare history books barely talk about, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, make sure you hit like and subscribe for more content like this, and comment below where you're listening from. Seriously, it still blows my mind that we're exploring these ancient stories together, from totally different parts of the world, connected across time and space by one shared obsession: the past. Now, Bayezid wasn't used to losing. The man was a force of nature. Just 5 years earlier, he strangled his own brother to secure the Ottoman throne. He crushed Bulgaria. He broke Serbia. He moved his armies with such terrifying speed that enemies often surrendered before his vanguard even appeared on the horizon. He looked at Wallachia and saw a speed bump, a small, insignificant buffer state standing between him and Hungary, and eventually the heart of Europe. He expected submission. Mircea saw something else. He looked at the map and saw a trap. Because Mircea wasn't stupid, he knew his 10,000 soldiers would evaporate against 40,000 Ottomans in open combat. So he did something insane. He deleted the battlefield. When Bayezid crossed the Danube, he stepped into a ghost world. No civilians, no food, no shelter, just silence. Because Mircea had ordered a complete evacuation, entire villages were moved into the Carpathian Mountains. He burned his own crops to ash, poisoned his own wells, destroyed everything. This was scorched earth on a suicidal scale. And when the Ottomans arrived, hungry and exhausted from the march, they found nothing but charred timber and empty wind. Bayezid pushed forward anyway, fueled by rage, because he needed a fight. He needed an enemy to crush. But Mircea refused to give him the satisfaction of a traditional battle line. Instead, Wallachian cavalry struck at night. They didn't try to win. They tried to bleed the Ottomans slowly. Arrows hissed out of the dark. Sentries dropped without a sound. Tent ropes were sliced. Supply carts were torched. Panic spread through the camps like fire. And by the time the Ottomans rallied, the attackers were already gone, melted back into the forest. Day after day, the Ottoman army marched deeper into the trap. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. Dysentery from poisoned water weakened their bodies. The mighty Thunderbolt began to slow down. Bayezid wasn't charging anymore. He was dragging a dying beast through mud, desperate to reach Wallachia's capital, desperate to force Mircea into a final stand. Because Bayezid believed that if he could just grab Mircea, just get his hands on him, he would crush him. What he didn't realize was that the ground beneath his horse's hooves was about to become his prison. He was marching toward a place called Rovine, and the earth there was already hungry. In most wars, geography is just scenery. In Wallachia, geography was the executioner. To understand what was happening to the Ottoman army, you have to look beneath their boots. This wasn't Anatolia. This wasn't open, rolling plain where Ottoman cavalry could spread out and charge like a tidal wave. This was something else entirely. A claustrophobic cage, ancient woodland, churning water, swampy valleys that swallowed men whole. Wallachia sits on the northern bank of the Danube, and for the Ottomans, the Danube wasn't just a border. It was a massive watery wall protecting the rest of Europe. Crossing it was a logistical nightmare that took days, and during that crossing, the Ottoman army became vulnerable and divided. But once they were across, things got worse, because the region ahead was something the Turks would later call Deli Orman, the Mad Forest. The trees grew thick and tangled. They blocked out the sun. Roots twisted across narrow trails like tripwires. For light infantry, sure, it's manageable. But for the Ottoman war machine, built around heavy armor and strict formations, it was catastrophic. The Sipahi cavalry, the pride of the Sultan, wore chainmail and plates of steel. Their massive war horses were armored too. On dry open fields, they were tanks. Here, in the damp autumn of the Balkans, they were anchors. Rains turned the soil into deep sludge. Every step became a struggle. Horses stumbled into hidden ravines and snapped their legs. Carts carrying arrows and food sank to their axles. Men had to drop their weapons just to push wagons forward. The Ottoman columns stretched longer and thinner, miles through the forest. They weren't an army anymore. They were a traffic jam. And Mircea understood that perfectly. He didn't try to match them in steel. He defeated them with mud. Because he knew the Ottomans' greatest strength, their weight, their armor, their discipline, could become their greatest weakness. While the Ottomans drowned in sludge, the Wallachians moved like ghosts. Leather armor, wool cloaks, light shields. They knew every game trail, every ravine, every hidden ford. They could strike the front of the Ottoman line, vanish into reeds, and strike the rear 10 minutes later. This constant harassment didn't just kill men, it killed morale. Because Ottomans were used to seeing their enemy. They wanted a shield wall to smash. Instead, they got silence. Then an arrow in the neck. Then silence again. The Mad Forest earned its name. Paranoia spread. Commanders began seeing ambushes in every shadow. Men wasted arrows shooting at swaying branches. And still, Bayezid refused to accept what was happening. His scouts reported the Wallachians retreating toward the Argesh River. Bayezid interpreted this as weakness, cowardice. He believed Mircea was running for his life. But Mircea wasn't running. He was leading the bull by the nose, dragging the Ottoman army deeper into the worst terrain possible, where 40,000 men would have no more room to fight than 4,000. The deeper they marched, the narrower the paths became. The vegetation thickened, the ground softened. Bayezid was marching his ironclad army into a geological vice, and he was about to learn a lesson that would be repeated centuries later in places like Vietnam and Afghanistan. A superpower cannot conquer a land that wants to kill it, and the trap at Rovine was waiting. The Thunderbolt was charging straight into the mud. Then the sun went down, and the nightmare truly began. Because for an Ottoman soldier, darkness in Wallachia wasn't time to rest. It was time to die. Mircea knew exhaustion turns warriors into clumsy animals, so he weaponized the night. As the Ottomans hacked through dense undergrowth, searching for flat ground to camp, the forest came alive. At first it was sound, bugles blaring, drums pounding, wolf howls that sounded just a little too human. Wallachians were out there, unseen, screaming into the darkness so no Turk could close his eyes. And then, the arrows started again. Not massive volleys like a battlefield. Erratic bursts, a sentry would gurgle and collapse. One shaft through the throat. A tent would catch fire. Chaos would erupt as thousands of soldiers scrambled for weapons, slashing at shadows, terrified of an attack that never fully came. By the time the Janissaries formed ranks, the forest would go silent again, and the Wallachians would be gone. An hour later, it would happen again, and again, and again. This was psychological warfare in its purest form. Mircea wasn't just killing men. He was stripping away their sanity, denying them the biological necessity of sleep. After days of this, the Ottoman army began hallucinating. Reflexes slowed, morale collapsed. They weren't fighting an army, they were fighting ghosts. Bayezid was furious. He ordered his heavy cavalry to chase the attackers. But it was a fool's errand. Wallachian horsemen knew every swamp path and ravine. The Ottoman pursuers would get lost, or stuck, and become easy prey for ambushers waiting in the dark. Mircea was executing a strategy of death by 1,000 cuts. He couldn't win with brute strength. So he turned the war into a contest of endurance. And he was gambling on Bayezid's arrogance, because he knew the Thunderbolt wouldn't turn back. Bayezid could not be seen retreating from forest dwellers. So Bayezid made the fatal calculation. He pushed his starving, exhausted, sleep-deprived army even faster, desperate to force a decisive battle and end the torment. He didn't realize that was exactly what Mircea wanted, because Mircea wasn't just harassing the Ottomans, he was hurting them. Every arrow, every raid, every false retreat was steering the Ottoman column toward one specific point on the map. A narrow, marshy valley near the Argesh River, a place where trees grew close together, and the ground beneath you could swallow a horse. A place prepared for slaughter. The stage was set for Rovine, and Bayezid had no idea he was marching into a meat grinder. Victory for an Ottoman Sultan usually smelled like smoke and tasted like wine. It meant chests of looted gold, kings dragged away in chains, long parades of captives marching under the thunder of drums. But as Bayezid pushed deeper into Wallachia, he found none of that, only silence. He captured villages that were already empty. He reached fortresses with gates wide open and granaries swept clean. The scorched earth policy wasn't just effective, it was absolute. And this was Mircea's master stroke. He denied Bayezid the one thing every conqueror needs to maintain authority: a visible win. No great battle, no glory, no decisive moment. Just mud, hunger, sickness, and the constant feeling that eyes were watching from the tree line. Even the Ottomans, the most disciplined soldiers in the world, began to mutter. They whispered that they weren't fighting men. They were fighting demons. They whispered that the land itself was rejecting them. Bayezid could feel his authority slipping through his fingers. He needed blood. He needed to pin Mircea down and crush him so violently that the humiliation of the past weeks would vanish under sheer terror. And then, finally, the scouts brought news. Mircea had stopped retreating. The Wallachian army was dug in near the Argesh River, in a marshy depression surrounded by thick woodland. To Bayezid, this didn't look like a trap. It looked like a mistake, like the infidel prince had finally run out of room to run. Bayezid didn't wait for his supply wagons. He didn't wait for the ground to dry. He ordered an immediate advance, and he should have asked himself one question. Why would a master of guerrilla warfare willingly choose to stop in a swamp? The place was known as Rovine. In Romanian, the word suggests a rugged, ruined, excavated landscape, broken ground. And Mircea hadn't simply chosen it. He'd engineered it. For days, his men had been digging. They carved a web of trenches across every patch of solid ground. They covered those ditches with brush, leaves, and thin soil, just enough to look safe. They sharpened wooden stakes and drove them into the mud at cavalry angles, hiding them beneath tall marsh grass. The entire battlefield was a trap disguised as terrain. Mircea positioned his forces in a crescent shape, backed into the forest. His center was deliberately thin, weak enough to tempt a direct charge. But his flanks? His flanks were packed with archers hidden deep in the tree line. He had turned geography into a funnel. So when the Ottoman vanguard emerged from the forest, they saw the Wallachian banner fluttering in damp air. They saw a small army, a frightened army, a doomed army. And Bayezid, watching from higher ground, smiled. He thought the campaign was over. He signaled the attack. Drums thundered, horns screamed, and the earth shook as thousands of armored cavalry spurred forward. These men roared, desperate to wash away weeks of frustration with Wallachian blood. They gathered speed, they thundered straight toward that weak center, and they had no idea. They were charging into a meat grinder because the collision never happened the way Bayezid expected. The first wave of Sipahi cavalry hit the Wallachian line and vanished. The ground swallowed them. Hidden trenches collapsed under the weight of thousands of tons of armored horse and man. Horses plunged into pits, impaled on stakes, screaming, thrashing, and then momentum turned into catastrophe. The second wave, blinded by dust and adrenaline, couldn't stop. They crashed directly into the backs of their fallen comrades. The third wave slammed into them. In seconds, the pride of the Ottoman army became a writhing heap of broken limbs, blood, and metal. It looked like the earth itself had opened up and devoured Bayezid's Thunderbolt. And then, the trap closed. From both flanks, Wallachian archers emerged from the trees. They didn't fire wildly. At this range, they couldn't miss. Arrows poured into the chaos. The Ottoman armor that could deflect sword blows was useless here, because bodkin points found every gap in the mail, necks, armpits, thigh joints. Men screamed as they were pinned in place, unable to move, unable to lift themselves out of the mud. And for those who managed to crawl out of the trenches, the mud was still waiting. The battlefield became a swamp of blood and mire. Heavy plate armor, the symbol of Ottoman wealth and power, became a death sentence. Men slipped, fell, were trampled by their own panic-stricken horses, or simply sank, suffocated beneath the sludge, too heavy to stand. Mircea watched from higher ground. He didn't send his infantry rushing into a chaotic brawl. He held them back. He let the terrain and arrows do the work. Cold, mathematical warfare. He was preserving his small population while spending Ottoman lives like cheap coin. Bayezid, watching from his ridge, went white with rage. He ordered the Janissaries forward. These were his elite infantry, trained from childhood, feared across continents. If anyone could salvage this disaster, it was them. But the valley betrayed them too. The narrow space meant they couldn't form their famous shield walls. They couldn't lock together into an unstoppable block. Instead, they had to squeeze through mud, climb over dead horses, step over the bodies of their own cavalry just to reach the enemy. And every step forward was answered with another storm of arrows. The sun began to set on what should have been a glorious Ottoman victory. Instead, Rovine became a graveyard of ambition. The noise was deafening. Not the clash of heroes, but the screams of men drowning in dirt. Bayezid, conqueror of kingdoms, had been stopped cold by a few ditches, and one man who understood how to dig. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was dying in the mud of Wallachia. Morning came, and the trenches of Rovine were filled to the brim with the finest armor in the east, now rusting in cold dew. The Thunderbolt had been grounded. For the first time in his meteoric rise, Sultan Bayezid looked at a battlefield and saw only failure. Thousands of men lost, not to a glorious enemy army, but to poison, mud, and shadows. The retreat was somber. The Ottoman army, usually a roaring procession of triumph, limped back toward the Danube in near silence. They left behind their dead, their pride, and the illusion that they could conquer anything. Mircea had done the impossible. He'd taken a poor, tiny principality and humiliated a superpower. And by all logic, this should have been his moment of triumph. He should have returned to his capital, Curtea de Argeș, hailed as the savior of Christendom, the dragon slayer, the man who broke the Thunderbolt. But history isn't a fairy tale. It's a cynical business. Because when Mircea marched back toward civilization, he didn't find open arms. He found closed gates. The Wallachian nobility, the Boyars, were fickle, terrified, and always calculating. They looked at the carnage at Rovine and didn't see victory. They saw a death sentence. Because they knew Bayezid. They knew the Ottomans had endless reserves of men and gold. And they believed he would come back. Not with 40,000. With 80,000. With fire. And when he returned, his wrath would be absolute. So in the kind of irony that defines Balkan history, the Boyars decided the hero was a liability, while Mircea was still wiping mud from his boots. A faction of nobles conspired against him. They didn't want a warrior prince who provoked empires. They wanted quiet. They wanted safety, even if safety meant submission. So they reached out to the retreating Ottomans and offered a deal. We will remove Mircea if you accept a new, more obedient ruler. Enter Vlad the Usurper, a man with a claim to the throne and a willingness to bow his head. Backed by Ottoman gold and Boyar betrayal, Vlad seized power. Mircea, the man who had orchestrated the greatest military upset of the century, suddenly found himself alone. His army was battered. His allies had turned their coats. He had defeated the Sultan, but he had lost his country. He fled north, crossing into Transylvania, a king without a crown, a victor running for his life. And this was the tragedy of Mircea the Old. He learned early that external enemies are easy to fight. You just need steel, or stakes, or poison. But internal enemies, they smile at you while sharpening the knife behind their back. Still, Mircea wasn't the type to disappear into a monastery. He was a survivor. As he rode into exile, he was already planning his return. He needed a new army. And he knew exactly which king might give him one. King Sigismund of Hungary. Politics makes strange bedfellows. Mircea found himself bowing to Sigismund, a man who had once tried to conquer Wallachia. But the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And right now, they both had a 400-pound tiger at their gates called the Ottoman Empire. Sigismund was terrified. He knew that after Rovine, Bayezid would return with vengeance. So Sigismund rang the alarm bells of Christendom. He called for a crusade, and Europe answered. In 1396, a glittering army assembled in Buda. This was the last crusade of the Middle Ages, a medieval dream team: Knights Hospitaller, Teutonic Knights, Hungarian forces, and the cream of French nobility. The French knights arrived looking like they were dressed for a tournament, not a war. Gold-plated armor, silk-covered horses, young, rich, arrogant, drunk on stories of King Arthur. They boasted that if the sky fell, they would hold it up with their lances. Mircea looked at this peacock parade and felt a pit in his stomach, because he was the only man in the room who had actually beaten Bayezid. He knew the Ottomans didn't care about silk, they cared about winning. At the war council outside Nicopolis, the clash of cultures was unbearable. Mircea stood up and offered a plan. He asked for permission to lead the vanguard. He explained that his light cavalry knew how to bait Ottoman archers, how to absorb the first shock, how to lure Bayezid into a trap. In other words, let me take the first hit, so you can deliver the killing blow. It was sensible, selfless, smart, and the French knights laughed in his face. To the Duke of Burgundy and French chivalry, letting a Balkan prince lead the charge was an insult. They didn't ride across Europe to watch someone else take glory. They declared they would lead. They would charge straight down the middle, smash the Turks, and be home in time for wine. Mircea looked to Sigismund. The Hungarian king knew Mircea was right, but he was powerless to stop French ego. So the plan was set. French knights would charge first. Mircea would cover a flank, and on the morning of September 25th, 1396, the French mounted their massive war horses. They looked magnificent. They screamed for God and glory as they charged up the hill toward the Ottoman line. They smashed through the first line of skirmishers easily. They felt invincible. They crested the hill expecting to see Bayezid fleeing. Instead, they saw a field packed with sharpened stakes, and behind those stakes, waiting in absolute silence, were the Janissaries, and behind them, the Sipahi cavalry. The French charge ground to a halt. Horses screamed as they hit stake pits. Knights were yanked from their saddles, crushed under maces, butchered in the mud. It was Rovine again, except this time on a massive scale. The cream of French nobility was trapped. From the rear, Mircea watched the trap snap shut. He watched Sigismund's forces rush forward too late, and he knew instantly the battle was lost. The Thunderbolt had returned, and the crusade was breaking. A lesser man might have charged in to die heroically, but Mircea wasn't foolish. He was pragmatic. He signaled his men, he turned his horses around, crossed back over the Danube, and destroyed the bridge behind him. He left the French to their fate, cold, brutal. But it was the only reason Wallachia lived to fight another day. History is full of strange luck, because just when it seemed like the Ottoman Empire was destined to swallow Europe whole, a monster arrived from the east. His name was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, and he was the kind of conqueror who made Bayezid look like a diplomat. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, the two titans collided, and the result shocked the world. The Thunderbolt was struck down, Bayezid was captured, humiliated, and according to legend, kept in a golden cage as Timur's footstool until he died of shame. The Ottoman Empire didn't just stumble, it shattered. Bayezid left behind a power vacuum and 4 sons who hated each other. This became the Ottoman Interregnum, a decade of civil war where the empire nearly tore itself apart from the inside. For most Christian rulers, this was a moment to breathe. For Mircea, it was an opportunity. He returned to Wallachia and reclaimed his throne with ease. The Boyars who had betrayed him suddenly remembered their loyalty when they saw him coming with soldiers behind him. But Mircea wasn't satisfied with simply being Prince of Wallachia again, because he'd learned the hard way. Defense isn't enough. If you want to survive, you have to control your enemy's chaos. So Mircea became the kingmaker of the Balkans. He looked at the squabbling Ottoman princes and decided to pick a favorite. He threw money, weapons, and military support behind one of Bayezid's sons, Musa Çelebi, helping him fight against his brothers. Not out of friendship, but because a divided Ottoman Empire was a weak Ottoman Empire. For years, the future Sultan of the Ottomans was practically decided in the court of Wallachia. Mircea hosted pretenders, funded campaigns, unleashed them like weapons against each other. A masterclass in Machiavellian politics before Machiavelli was even born. And during this period, Wallachia reached its zenith. Mircea pushed his borders to the Black Sea. He controlled vital trade routes, the mouths of the Danube. He styled himself as ruler from the mountains to the sea. He wasn't the old man hiding in swamps anymore. He was the most powerful Christian ruler in southeastern Europe. He had outlived the Thunderbolt. He had outlasted the French knights who mocked him. He was playing 4D chess while the rest of Europe played checkers. But the Game of Thrones is never safe, because eventually, one Ottoman brother would win. Eventually, the empire would reunite, and whoever sat on that throne would remember exactly who had interfered in their family's bloodbath. The dragon had been asleep, but it was going to wake up. And time is the one enemy that can't be ambushed in a swamp. By 1417, the Ottoman Empire had healed its wounds. Sultan Mehmed I had eliminated his brothers and turned his gaze back to the Danube. Mircea was now truly the Old. He was in his 60s, ancient for a warrior prince in the Balkans. The Mad Forest could no longer protect him. The Ottomans had learned. They seized key fortresses along the Danube. They tightened the noose. They were at Wallachia's door again. And Mircea faced one final, agonizing choice. He could fight a suicidal war, one that might erase Wallachia from the map, turning it into a direct Ottoman province like Bulgaria. Or he could swallow his pride. He chose survival. Mircea signed a treaty. He agreed to pay annual tribute, 2,000 gold ducats, and he sent his own sons as hostages to the Ottoman court to guarantee his obedience. On the surface, it sounds like defeat, but in reality, it was his greatest diplomatic victory. Because by paying protection money, Mircea ensured Wallachia remained autonomous. It kept its own laws, its own church, its own nobility. While the rest of the Balkans fell under direct Ottoman rule, Wallachia survived as itself. But Mircea also knew gold alone wouldn't secure the future. He needed to harden his bloodline, to make sure the next generation could survive what was coming. So he turned west, to his old frenemies, to King Sigismund. Sigismund had founded a chivalric order dedicated to fighting the enemies of Christianity, the Order of the Dragon. Its symbol was a dragon, tail curled around its own neck, dead, but still powerful. Mircea's illegitimate son, Vlad, would eventually be inducted into this order. And when Vlad returned to Wallachia wearing the dragon medallion, the common people didn't know Latin. They didn't know what Draco meant in the chivalric sense. But in the local Romanian dialect, the word drac meant two things: dragon and devil. So Vlad became Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon. or Vlad the Devil. And his son, the boy born in Transylvania, would inherit all of Mircea's cruelty, but arguably less of his restraint. He would be known as the son of the dragon, Dracula. And that right there is the real origin story. Mircea the Old didn't just leave behind a country, he left behind a philosophy. He taught his descendants that in this corner of the world, morality is a luxury. Survival requires you to become the dragon. When Mircea lay on his deathbed in 1418, burying his face in the stones of the Kozia monastery, he wasn't just a dying ruler. He was the grandfather of a nightmare that was about to wake up. History has a strange way of remembering people. Today, pop culture is obsessed with the grandson, Vlad the Impaler, the inspiration for Dracula. We remember the forests of impaled corpses. We remember the bloodlust. We remember the monster. But we forget the teacher. Because Vlad Dracula didn't invent the tactics that made him infamous. He inherited them. When Vlad famously attacked Sultan Mehmed II at night near Targovishte in 1462, causing chaos in the Ottoman camp, he was essentially reenacting Mircea's campaign of 1394. When Vlad used scorched earth, burning villages to starve the Turks, he was reading straight from Mircea's playbook. The only difference was volume. Mircea used terror like a surgeon's scalpel, a necessary evil to ensure his state survived. Vlad used terror like a paintbrush, covering the entire canvas in red. Mircea the Old was the prototype, the original. He proved that a small, insignificant nation could bring a superpower to its knees, not by fighting harder, but by fighting dirtier. He understood the grim mathematics of asymmetric warfare centuries before the term existed. If you're small, you can't afford honor. You can't afford fair play. You must become the environment. You must become the mud, the disease, the nightmare in the dark. And in Romania today, Mircea is not remembered as a cruel warlord. He's remembered as Mircea cel Bătrân, the wise, the elder, the grandfather of the nation. His face appears on currency. His statues stand in cities. While the world fears his grandson as a vampire, Romanians revere the grandfather as a shield. Ultimately, the legend of Mircea the Old is a lesson in resilience, a story about how a speed bump broke an empire. It reminds us that when the odds are impossible, when the enemy is at the gates, the most dangerous weapon isn't the sword in your hand. It's the willingness to do whatever is necessary to survive. The dragon didn't begin with Dracula. It began here, in the mud of Rovine, with an old man who refused to kneel. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal origins of the Dracula legend, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And I want to hear from you. Do you think history has unfairly overshadowed Mircea in favor of his more violent grandson? Or was Vlad's cruelty necessary to finish what Mircea started? Let me know in the comments below.